All right. So, to those of you who are joining us now, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Sexuality on the Spectrum. My name is Jessica Rains and I'm your host for today's event. It's great to have you all here with us today. Now, I do have the distinct pleasure of introducing today's speakers. There's Dr. Peter Gerhardt and then Amy Gravino. So, I want to go ahead and tell you a little bit about our guests today. And now with Dr. Gerhardt, he's an executive director of the EPIC School of Paramus, New Jersey. He has more than 35 years of experience utilizing the principles of ABA in support of adolescents and then adults with A.S.C.O.T in educational, employment, residential, and then community-based settings. Now, on those topics, he is internationally renowned author and expert. In addition to serving as OAR's Scientific Council co-chair, Dr. Gerhardt is on numerous professional advisory boards, including the Cambridge Center of Behavioral Studies. Now for Amy Gravino. As a certified autism specialist, she mentors, consults, and coaches students with autism and their families. Now, Ms. Gravino is an international speaker and currently serves on the board of Special Listern USA, and then also the Golden Door International Film Festival of Jersey City. Now, Gravino is currently working on her book called The Naughty Audie, a memoir of her experiences with dating, relationships, and then sexuality from the first-hand perspective as a woman on the autism spectrum. All righty. So now, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn over to Peter and Amy. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of Amy and myself, I want to welcome all of you here to our webinar. But first, there we go. I always start with this slide, which is no group in this country faces the sort of sexual and reproductive restrictions disabled people do. We are frequently preventing them from marrying, bearing or rearing children, learning about sexuality, having sexual relationships, having access to sexual literature. Sexual confusion arises as a consequence of society forcing us to internalize the notion that we are sexually inferior. For the longest time, we really didn't consider people with intellectual and developmental disabilities full citizens, let alone full adults. And since they were neither, the idea of them being sexual or being able to have a two-person relationship was often not, it wasn't just that it wasn't thought of, it was banned by law. We are not the most progressive country in many ways when it comes to this particular issue, which is also why we have very little research on this topic. But the following presentation contains language and imagery of a sexual nature and may be considered inappropriate for younger listeners and viewers. We are going to talk about sex in this webinar. When you talk about sex, sometimes you have to use language that most people don't hear in a typical professional presentation. If at some point either one of us say something that you're offended by, first of all, toughen up. Second of all, you can blame either Amy or myself, but don't blame or did not vet this presentation, did not review the content. This is completely our talk, right?
Yes, absolutely.
As a general rule of thumb, when we talk about sex education, about 60% probably should be home-based because it involves personal values, family values, culture, all this stuff. About 37% may be done in the context of the school, and then when necessary, about 3% by specialists. This is kind of important. It is just my opinion, but it is important to know the level of your expertise when engaging in this particular area. Just sitting through this webinar today does not make you an expert in this area. This is a complex area. I know the limits of my expertise, which is why there are times when I have to refer out to other specialists. But it is something that has to involve the family. It involves culture. It's a very complex topic. I want to quickly, because I talk about risk, one of the things really to understand is that this is probably the riskiest area that you can work in, given sort of the cultural and social restrictions. So the first thing that you need to know, again, is to understand your level of expertise and not go beyond it. And the second thing is you need to understand typical sexual development to determine what is and what is not appropriate target for intervention. The simplest example I usually give is it's very common for little 4-year-olds to follow somebody into the bathroom to see what's going on. A 4-year-old on the spectrum might do the exact same thing. That's developmentally appropriate, not a problem. However, if they do it when they're 10 or 12, then it becomes a problem. So it's not necessarily the behavior itself, it's the age of the behavior and the developmental reference for it. But I really do recommend very strongly that if you are going to even venture somewhat into this area, that you or your organization has to have a policy on sexual education intervention, and if appropriate, instructional risk, but you have to put out in writing what you're planning on doing, how you're planning on doing it, why you're planning on doing it, so that your parents, your students, your board, your supporters all know what's going on, so that nobody is surprised by the fact that you're actually working in this area. But now back to sexuality in general. A couple quick working definitions. One is sexuality is an integral part of the personality of everyone, man, woman, and child. It's a basic need and an aspect of being human that cannot be separated from other aspects of human life. This is important. Sexuality is not synonymous with sexual intercourse. Sexuality is who you are, not who you sleep with. It is a personal characteristic. Your sexuality influences your thoughts, feelings, actions, and interactions, and thereby our mental and physical health. This is the World Health Organization's definition from 1975. Yes, they do have a more recent definition. I think it's 2002, but it's very expansive, gets into fantasies and fetishes and paraphilias and all of this. It's a little too expansive for our purposes today, but one of the things that I point out is that every permutation of sexual expression that we see in the typical world, we should expect to see in the A.S.D. world. For example, the most common paraphilia fetishistic behavior among typical men is a shoe or foot fetish. I don't know why, it's not my area of expertise, just is. Although the research is scarce, it does appear that the most common paraphilia fetishistic behavior among adult men on the spectrum is a shoe or foot fetish. Again, I don't know why, just seems to be. So whatever we see in the typical world, we will see in the A.S.D. world. Sex can simply mean gender, whether you're male or female, but it can also mean the physical act of sexual intercourse. And then, of course, sex education is a lifelong process that encompasses many things, the biological, social, cultural, psychological, and spiritual dimensions of sexuality. Now, here's where it immediately gets tricky. You'll see that there are 4 types of sexual language. Now, first we have polite, in which we might say vagina. Then there's technical, where you would get into labia, cervix, clitoris, vulva. Then there's cute, where you might say vajayjay, muffin, little man on the boat, punani, lady parts. I'm not going to say the slang. You guys can read them. But here's the quiz for you guys. Quick, think of another name for hand. And you can't. Think of another name for calf. And you can't. But if I ask you, think of another word for penis, all 200 and something on the webinar would raise your hands and say that you have a different one. The language that we use in this area is very confusing in and of itself. So I really do encourage you all, use the real language. Okay, don't use fake language, don't use cute language. Encourage your families to use real language. You know, don't get into the pee-pee, woo-woo, ta-tas nonsense. Penis, breast, vagina, like good words, correct words. Yes, I know that vagina is actually the internal part that's the passageway, but you know what I mean when I say it. So, plus if you get into the slang, like each one of those words there has other meanings, you know, so please just be as clear as possible. In addition, folks on the spectrum tend to be concrete thinkers who tend to interpret things literally. For example, now this is a very quick example. This was a study done in 1997 by Constantaris and Lunsky. It's an older study, but it's still very valid. And what they did, they showed photographs. This is one of the photographs that they showed. to adult men on the spectrum, men who were verbal, not high verbal, not conversational really, but verbal. And they asked, tell me about this picture. To which the adult replied, the people were sitting on the couch being friends. Now, the problem here is, first of all, that's not my definition of sitting. But if this is his definition of being friends, that's a problem. Because friends with benefits, you might want to explain and say that that's it. But if he doesn't know the difference between what friends do, what strangers do, what acquaintances do, what boyfriend and girlfriend do, that becomes a problem. So him thinking that friends do this is a pending challenge to him, to somebody else, to the legal system. So please, I really do encourage everybody, be careful with this word friends. Okay, if you're a teacher, don't say to one student, go get your friends and let's line up for lunch when you're just meeting classmates. Say classmates. Friends has a very particular definition. As a country, as a culture, we don't want to talk about sex. It's kind of weird because it's something that's on TV all the time. It's prevalent in our advertising. But to have an open, honest discussion about sexuality, TMI, too much information. Like I don't want to talk about that. This is even truer when it comes to sex ed in our schools. According to the CDC, fewer than half of all high schools and only 20% of middle schools offer comprehensive sex ed curriculum. Further, only 23 states mandate sex ed at all, and of those, 13 require it to be medically accurate. So this presents a problem. So then, where are individuals getting their information? It's got to be on the slide. Well, apparently nowhere, since the slide's not moving. So
I'm clicking it. It's not.
You seem to be a bit. Oh, here we go.
Okay.
And that access to information, that was for typical kids where the sexuality education is available. For individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities, access to information is even worse. Richards, 2006, noted that historically, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities have been viewed as sexually deviant, prone to criminality, asexual, and problematic. Despite significant progress over the past 5 decades, the sexuality of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities is still grossly misunderstood. And although today the sexuality of individuals with an intellectual and developmental disability is not ignored, denied, or punished, the perception of people as perpetual children, irrespective of their age, lingers with significant negative consequences. We still continue to use this potentially offensive statistic, their mental age score. So you'll see this oftentimes in the media that like a 35-year-old man with the mind of a 7-year-old was lost. That just implies that he's the little kid in the big body, and it just it infantilizes the whole thing and then gives people reason not to talk about this stuff. When a 35-year-old man with an intellectual or developmental disability or an autism spectrum disorder is a 35-year-old man. Like they have 35 years of experience. They're different experiences than mine, but they still have 35 years of life. But the fact is we're all sexual beings, but you know that. But we all go through puberty. Puberty is the sequence of events by which a child becomes an adult. It's the beginning of hormones going through your body. In girls, puberty typically begins around 8 and it's over by the age of 16. In boys, it begins around 9 and it's largely complete by 18. But this is the physiological aspect. This is not emotional maturity. This is the body changing in result of growth. Oftentimes, we tend to ignore or misinterpret the impact of puberty on individuals with autism spectrum disorders. We often forget that there can be a real emotional impact, just like there is with typical teens. We sometimes forget that general stimulation is universal. I mean, it's nothing new, but we kind of overreact when we see it in someone on the spectrum. And what we need to really start doing is sort of think 5 years down the road. And where are we going with this? She's 10. What does she need to know when she's 15? She's 15. What does she need to know when she's 20? She's 5. What does she need to know when she's 10? And how much research is there on sexual education related to sexuality and related interventions in ASD? Almost nothing. Very quickly, some things we do know, at least some of the gap in our understanding, is that we don't know much about sexuality in general. So it's very difficult to get research dollars to look at human sexuality, no matter what your potential label is. High verbal individuals have similar interests as their typical peers. While high verbal adults may know the language of sexuality, this does not seem to equate to qualitative or quantitative knowledge. What that means is language may be a very misleading indicator of what somebody knows and doesn't know. So if you ask somebody, what should you do if someone approaches you in a threatening way or you feel that this is inappropriate contact, they can tell you what they're supposed to do, but when the time comes, they may not do it. So that's a real important point. And there does appear to be a greater diversity of sexual expression with high verbal individuals, with higher reported rates of asexuality, bisexual, and homosexuality, particularly among women on the spectrum. So, although data are limited, there are published reports of parasitic behavior. We talked about that. But there's also this idea of counterfeit deviance. Counterfeit deviance is someone may engage in a behavior that under normal circumstances may be actually quantified as deviant, but because the person doesn't understand the situation, it really is not, and so counterfeit deviance is what's used there. McDaniels and Fleming did a review of sexuality education and basically found out there's a paucity of published data resulting in little information. So we just have a big gap in our understanding. A couple good reasons why we should teach human sexuality to everyone, including folks on the spectrum. One, they have the same hormones and urges and need to make the same choices. Absolutely. The next is all sexual behavior is social behavior, and as such is particularly challenging for individuals with ASD. The internet and other readily accessible media. Internet porn has become the bane of my existence. In a national survey of youth from 10 to 17 years, they reported that 25% of youth had unwanted exposure to sexual pictures on the internet. There was a 2014 study found a very similar number. For example, I just went to Bing Images. I did take off the safe filter, which is just flip the switch, and I typed in woman in kitchen, and all it took me was 4 images to get to a naked photo. Then it went 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 to get full frontal nudity. So it's very, very accessible on the internet. Number 2 is the aspect of the criminal justice system. This is one area that particularly high verbal individuals are most at risk, because if they touch somebody inappropriately, if they make an inappropriate comment, if they stare too long at someone, they may end up in a situation involving the criminal justice system. And like I said, this is where errors really may have significant consequence. And then lastly, because they're people, and like all people, they have the right to learn all they can to be healthy, sexually healthy people.
So then, what better way can there possibly be to understand the unique sexual experiences of someone on the spectrum than with a real-life naughty audience such as me to tell you all about it? So I'm going to share with you now some of my experiences as a woman on the spectrum that I've gone through, in the hope that it'll help you with the individual in your life that you love or are working with to understand them better. So just to ask you all real quick, who do you talk to about sex and dating? Your family? Do you talk to your parents or a sibling? Maybe you talk to a therapist or a counselor? Maybe you talk to a religious leader. Kind of weird to talk to a rabbi or a priest about sex, but you never know. Probably a lot of you talk to your friends about sex and dating, right? Or maybe you don't have anyone to talk to or don't feel comfortable talking about it. When I gave a presentation on sexuality to a group of college students earlier this year, I asked them this very question. They were all on the spectrum, and the majority of them said they didn't have anyone to talk to or didn't feel comfortable talking about sexuality. So imagine this is such an important topic, and you don't have anyone to talk to about it at all. And that's what a lot of folks on the spectrum go through, and what creates so many other challenges, because there's just simply no one to talk to about this. So I am all the things that you heard about in the introduction, how I'm a professional speaker and all that. But back in 1996, like any 13-year-old girl, I was starting to have crushes. I was starting to notice my preferred gender, which happened to be guys. And you may wonder why Davy Jones is there. I happened to discover the Monkees at this point, 30 years after they were popular, of course, which did wonders for my popularity in school. And so Davy Jones ended up being one of my big crushes. Yeah, so this was when I was starting to have those same feelings and noticings as my peers. But even though I was starting to have that interest at that age, like my other peers, that did not correlate to the age when I had my first experiences with the opposite sex. There was a massive disconnect between what I had curiosities about, what I was thinking about, and actual opportunities that I had to explore it. So when I started going through puberty, for example, my parents and I never really had the talk about puberty. There was so much else that we were dealing with, be it dealing with the school system, with my being bullied, with getting academic supports, whatever it may have been, that sex and puberty talk just kind of fell through the cracks. And so when I first had my period, for instance, I went through 5 pairs of underwear and not having any idea what was going on. And then my mother came in the bathroom and all of a sudden said, "Oh, you're a woman now." And I said, "Huh?" I didn't know what that meant. And so I had a real sense of disconnection from my body. There was definitely this feeling of, just being a woman in this society, our bodies are open to comment. And then especially as someone on the spectrum, I often felt as though my body wasn't really mine. Whatever people said it was what it was. And so I just didn't have that sense of self-awareness of my body and what was going on with it. So where I learned about sex was from my peers and online, which are 2 of the worst sources probably imaginable, but that was what was available at the time. And they say that men watch their porn and women read their porn, and that was certainly true for me. I read a lot of erotica. That was how I began to explore my sexuality, because I did not have any real-life learning opportunities to explore it. So because of those difficulties, that was what sent me to being online. I began to develop friendships online. I would go into the Backstreet Boys chat room on Yahoo, and I made friends there. I became the designated smut writer for our group, and I was looking for relationships there. I often say that I'm the first person in the history of the world who went on the internet to be themselves instead of to be someone else, because I couldn't be myself in the real world. It wasn't accepted. I was bullied. But I didn't realize how vulnerable I was, because there was someone who came into the chat room one day, and he said that he was AJ from the Backstreet Boys. Well, I had no reason not to believe him. I thought it was him, and I didn't find out till much later that he was some schmuck who lived in Michigan, and my parents had hired a private investigator to look into him, which I didn't know. And so who knows who this person really was and what could have happened to me had we not been more diligent. And I really got lucky. I feel like, again, this was before Facebook and before Snapchat and all the things that exist now, but I still was very vulnerable as a young girl and a person on the spectrum. And what really drove me to being online was the continued disappointment of those real life experiences. As I said, no guys would go near me with a 10-foot pole. And the few encounters that I began to have were one disappointment after another. When I was 15, a boy moved in across the street, and he had the cutest freckles and a bowl haircut that put Julius Caesar to shame. And I fell for him right away. And he would invite me over to, we'd be hanging out, and he'd say, "Oh, Amy, I wanted to show you something on the computer." And because I wanted to establish an emotional closeness with him, but I didn't understand how, I would compensate with physical closeness. So I'd come over, and I'd be hovering right on top of him in his personal space, not realizing that he was getting very annoyed and angry with me. And he finally stopped speaking to me. And every time I'd see him across the street, I would wave, and he would just glare and squint his eyes at me. And about 50, 100 glares and squints later, I finally got the message. Again, my first French kiss, it was on a dare, as you will, at an ice skating rink. And I, kissed this boy, and I called him at home, and I couldn't understand why his mother was so upset that a 17-year-old girl was calling her 14-year-old son. "Don't ever call here again. How dare you call here?" she yelled at me. And I thought, well, why? I don't know. What did I do? And so I was completely shut away from him. Coincidentally, as it turned out, I learned several years ago that he came out as gay, which I'm not surprised by given my track record, but so it goes. And then, of course, my senior prom. I thought I was going to have my one perfect high school moment, and I really wanted to go. And I'd had a crush on a boy all year who was a junior, and the only way juniors go to senior prom is with a senior. So I asked him, and he said yes. but he was friends with the seniors, not me. And so we had one or two obligatory slow dances, but the majority of the night he was on the dance floor dancing with other girls, his friends, people he knew, and I sat at the table writing poetry on scraps of paper. So I didn't have my perfect high school moment. But when I finally go to college, then I had my first boyfriend. Oh, at long last, all I've ever wanted, my dreams coming true. But what the heck do you do to be a girlfriend? What does that mean? Instead of just being myself and being who I was, because I didn't understand at the time that I don't want a guy to date me just because he wants a girlfriend. I want him to want to date me. I tried to play the role of a girlfriend. What was expected of me? Well, I had to laugh at his jokes, even if they're not funny. I have to be nice to his parents. I have to go wherever he wants to go. But there was a discrepancy again between what was expected of me as a girlfriend and what I was able to do, because I just was so inexperienced and so clueless. And so he, did end up dumping me twice. And after the breakup, there was one night where we were out on the front stoop of the dormitory that I lived in this dormitory on the top floor, and he and a mutual friend of ours lived together on the first floor. And I went out onto the stoop, and my ex was, oh, nobody wants you here. We don't care what you have to say. Get out of here. And I was all indignant, all, 5 foot tall, 100 pounds of me. How dare you? I have every right to be out here. It's a free country. And he was 6'3", and he proceeded to kick me in the shin and slap me on my forehead, which is technically assault, but it was really childish and pathetic assault. But nonetheless, our mutual friend, when we got back inside, told me to call the RA and tell them what happened, that he'd back me up. So I wound up doing that. I wound up going to the police, getting a protection from abuse order, which is like a diet restraining order. And he had to move out of the dorm, no third-party contact, and it was traumatic. It was not something I ever expected to go through, certainly. But when I look back, we tried to remain friends after the breakup, and he turned into a verbally abusive jerk, and I never really understood it. I thought that I needed to stay friends with him because I wouldn't have any other friends. And again, my self-confidence was not in that good place. So I look at my old diary entries, and I say, Amy, what are you doing? You deserve better than this. Don't be friends with this jerk. But this is where I was at that time in my lack of experience. So, oh, Emily? Oh, okay. So, but one of the good things, though, about having my first boyfriend was I began to discover my own body, which I said before I was so disconnected from. We were fooling around one time, and I remember I looked down, and I all of a sudden I realized, oh my gosh, I have pubic hair, and it has a function. It's like the Black Forest. I should probably do something about that. And of course, he was like a chia pet down there, but did I get to say anything about that? No, I didn't get any input. No, sir. But immediately my mind went to wanting to please him and wanting to do things to make him happy because of the fear that if we broke up, nobody would want me. And so I started to become connected to my body and started seeing myself as a sexual being, which I never had before. Someone who not only had the power to receive pleasure, that someone would actually want to, do things to me, but who would be somebody that people would want to do things to them, which I had never experienced up until then. So it was a real awakening of sorts, and a learning experience, as I say. So, but another, new thing that I did experience after the breakup, about 2 years later, was stalking, and this was a new experience to me as well. A man who happened to be on the spectrum, he saw me at a conference one conference, and became kind of obsessed. And the thing about stalking is we don't explain about stalking to people. We have an idea in our minds of the kinds of people that get stalked. And so in my mind, I was never the kind of person who would be stalked. Why would someone stalk me? But stalking is actually about the person doing the stalking, not about the stalking victim. So he, had this idea in his mind, and he lived in Massachusetts, and at the time that this occurred, I was 22 years old, and he was, I would say, 36. And he drove from Massachusetts to my friend's employment place in Pennsylvania, where I had been in college, because he wanted to talk to her about me. And I was horrified. And then he also wanted to meet me in person, and I was very reluctant, but again, I think I forgave too many things and excused things because he was on the spectrum, things I wish I wouldn't have excused that were not acceptable. And so I relented, and I had a male friend come with me. And this is a photo of when we met. You could see how comfortable I look looking at my body language. So, but it took me a very long time, many years, to understand that this actually was stalking. I just never thought of it in such a way. But it was, and I certainly would handle it differently if it happened now. So finally, 22 years old, I fall in love for the first time. Now, I had been very scientific about my feelings. I knew that I had loved my first boyfriend, but I wasn't in love with him. And so at 22, I had met this guy in the worst possible place online. And I wound up moving across the country to Seattle, Washington after I graduated from college. And I knew that I was in love with him. And I remember we were sitting in his car one night, and I turned to him and I said, I think that I'm in love with you. And you know what his response was? I know. Very Han Solo of him, really, when you think about it. But instead of, kind of rolling my eyes, my thought was, oh, of course he knows me better than I know myself, because being in love makes you stupid. And so I knew I wanted to lose my virginity to him. I knew, because I had had opportunities in college, but I knew I wasn't ready. Nobody, I wasn't going to let anybody pressure me. And with him, I knew I was ready. And so I got on the birth control pill before I moved to Seattle without my father seeing, of course. And I waited the full month you're supposed to wait for it to kick in before the first time. And I was doing all these things to prepare for this to happen. And, here I am, and I think that, I'm all set and I'm all ready for this. I told him to wear a white button-down shirt because I'd always dreamed of unbuttoning a guy's shirt when we were about to make love. And I had the bottle of wine picked out, and I had music on a CD. But I said to myself, I want to know if I'm doing a good job. Because, again, I'm still in this mindset where I don't have a lot of confidence. And I feel like if I screw up, he won't ever want to have sex with me again. Nobody will want to have sex with me again. And I thought, well, when you eat at a restaurant or you stay at a hotel, they have these cards that you can fill out to say what your experience was like. And so why don't I make a sexual intercourse comment card? And so I created this card, and this is the front of the card. And I gave it to him after, we finished our deed, and he filled it out, bless him. But these are the questions, and they may be a little bit difficult to read on your screen. I'm not sure. I'll just read you a couple. What did you enjoy most about this sex session? What do you think could have been better? Please rate the following from 1 to 5. The outfit I had on, my facial expressions, my vocal volume. Is there anything I can do in the future to get you aroused more quickly? And the issue with these questions is that these questions are all about his enjoyment. There's not a word about my pleasure, about did I enjoy myself. There's nothing here. Coincidentally, though, when I told Peter about this, he said, Amy, that's the most ask-me thing I've ever heard of, and I think the world would be a better place if more people did this. So perhaps it would, who knows? But so this was my conception of getting feedback about sex. This was, again, where I was. And so then the inevitable, of course, occurred. What I did not know at the time that I lost my virginity to this person, and what I found out about 6 months later was that he'd had a girlfriend the whole time, he'd been lying to me and to her, sleeping with half of Seattle. And when this all came out, I found this out either online or on the phone. He never told me face to face. There was no face to face confrontation. That's how much of a coward he was. And I became the target. All these other girls that he'd been sleeping with were calling his girlfriend to say how great he was in bed, but she was the one calling me and harassing me. She threatened to kill me if I didn't leave town. Which you asked me all these questions about my time with him and all these things. And it was devastating. And every time the phone would ring, I knew that it was going to be her, but I would inevitably pick it up because I would hope that it was him saying that he was choosing me over her because I was in love with him. And I'd never been a target quite like this. And on top of everything, as I mentioned, I met this guy online on a message board for fans of Kevin Smith, the movie director. And this guy sent me an email saying, your first time was the grossest thing I ever did. You were just a retarded whore that I asked. And his girlfriend went into his account on the message board and posted this email for everybody to read. So this very private thing suddenly became very public, turned into an 11-page thread that everybody was commenting on. And it was devastating, as I said. And the one thing that I discovered at this time was that there are two types of moving on. And I had to go through the first type in this case, which was where he was kind of ripped out of my life. I haven't seen him since this all occurred. This was 12 years ago, and I have not seen him. And so I had no choice but to try to move on. It was, heartbreaking. When I had lost my virginity to him, I was actually wearing a University of Washington cheerleader uniform. I had started off naked, as you do, and then he was having trouble maintaining his how do you do. And I said, okay, I have a surprise for you. So I took out the uniform because he said he liked cheerleaders, and I put it on. and we concluded our activities with me in this cheerleader uniform. And when this all happened, I put the uniform in a brown bag, along with, I'd given him a diary that was engraved with his name and a pen, and he returned them outside my building at 6 o'clock in the morning, again, coward, in a box. And I took them all to the side of the building in a paper bag, and I set them on fire. And it was this very cathartic moment and this release, and it was cleansing right up until the fire department came because the alarms went off from the smoke. And I thought I was going to go to jail, but I didn't. But so this was, I'd never experienced heartache like this before. This was absolutely devastating, and it took me, I would say, a good 7 years to fully get over him and what happened. But I did discover an inner strength that I didn't actually know that I had, which was amazing, because he sent me a message maybe about, because the harassment went on for about 3 months. And after it stopped, he messaged me and he said, "Sorry for ruining your life." And I thought, how dare you give yourself that much credit? You didn't ruin my life. I'm still here. I'm still standing. I didn't fall apart, So that made me realize that I am stronger than I ever knew. And the way that I knew that I had truly moved on, and this is the moving on part 2, was after, the 7 years of really trying to get over it, I developed feelings for someone new, which I didn't think I'd be able to do. And not only did I develop feelings for someone new, but things ended up not working out with that guy, and I was still okay. And I didn't think I'd be able to get through that, but that was how I knew I had truly moved on, and it took a very long time. So, and of course, because nothing can be without an interesting epilogue, a few years ago, I went to present at a conference in New Orleans, and I had discovered by way of social media that this guy was no longer living in Seattle, but had moved to New Orleans and was bartending in a hotel 3 blocks from where I was at the conference. And I decided against my better judgment to go there to see him, to try to get that closure that I was chasing. And I go into the bar, and I see someone from behind that looks like him, and turns around, and it's not him. And I said, his name, is he working today? And the guy said, no, he wasn't there. And in that moment, I knew that was my closure. I was never going to get any kind of closure from him that didn't already come from myself. So it was a whole different kind of closure than I ever expected, but that's how these things work out sometimes. So just a brief mention, because I do have actually a master's degree in ABA. I conducted my thesis study using ABA to teach dating skills to 2 adults on the spectrum, how to ask someone on a date. And so I had 2 guys who were diagnosed as being on the spectrum, and I used the combination of didactic instruction, which is written instruction, the checklist that we went over, and then they would role play with somebody who was working with me in the study. I would record them, and then they would watch their video next to another video of the target behavior. And so I was measuring all these different variables: eye contact, vocal tone, because some of our people on the spectrum can be kind of monotone, physical proximity, were they too close, were they far away? And the way it worked out was my participants. I thought I was going to have participants who weren't going to know what to say, but my guys were very chatty, but nothing they were saying was going to get them a date in any chance in hell. And so it ended up being a challenge, because of that difference. And so there was not much of an appreciable change in the data from baseline to generalization because their levels were so high. And the major issue for me for this is that in the study, I did it that if they do this, this, and that, the person will say yes. But in the real world, people have free will. So you can do everything, quote, right, and somebody can still say, no, I don't want to go out with you. So how do you prepare for that? How do you deal with rejection is a big question when we look at this. So back to Peter.
It's always hard to follow Amy because but it's so important to understand that those of us in the field, we can talk about this from a very professional point of view, but really what we're talking about is people's lives. It's not just an abstract topic. Everything we do is about ideally making people's lives better. And this is one area where we need to obviously do a much, much, much better job. If we look at like the 4 main goals of sexuality education, one is to provide accurate factual information. I mean, this is relatively straightforward and relatively easy. Develop the necessary social competence and cultural awareness. Obviously less straightforward and more complex. Promote individual safety is probably one of the most complex areas of this that we try to work in. And then lastly is develop appropriate values and beliefs. I usually classify that as outside my area of expertise, besides the fact that by the time I meet someone, they have their values set. They have their beliefs set. I'm not meeting kids at 6 and working on sexuality with them. So they come to me with a fully, and values and beliefs are next to impossible to change in the context of what I'm trying to do, so I just have to work within them no matter what. So in terms of information, from an early age, just looking at some of these discriminations that we can teach. So restrict nudity in public parts of the house. Dress and undress in bedroom or bathroom. Now, I just want to point out that if you teach independent dressing, if you teach independent toileting, if you teach independent showering, yes, those are life skills, but they are also sexual safety skills, because that means that no paid staff, no uncle, no aunt, nobody else ever has to be in that situation with the person again in their lives. So it is a critical skill to start teaching early so that by the time they do hit this age, that they're able to do this as independently as possible. Teach use of robe, caregiver, model knocking on doors before going in and teaching people to knock on doors, an incredibly important skill. So just think ahead and be proactive. Like I said, you have to think down the road. Like if you wait, Dorothy Griffiths has written that most people with intellectual and developmental disabilities only get sexual education after they've done something illegal or problematic. And by that time, that's closing the barn door after the horse is run. So think ahead. Be concrete. If you can't, don't use like birds and the bees and the petals of a flower and like the opening of it. It's like just be concrete. If you can't be concrete, then you're not the person to teach this. Task analyze everything. Like there's information out there that you can get to see how would you teach pregnancy. Now, for some people, I'm going to leave out like gonadotropin and follicle stimulating hormones, but I do need to know that it really should be in there. Be consistent, be repetitive. Incredibly important when we're talking about safety skills, because hopefully safety skills are sort of low frequency skills. So you want to make sure that it stays in somebody's repertoire. What are the correct implications, and teach all steps in the correct order? I usually use a very quick example of a young man who got in trouble because he would go up to women, introduce himself and say, "Hi, my name is made-up name John. Can I touch your arm? Hi, my name is John. Can I touch your breasts? Hi, my name is John. Can I touch your foot?" All different body parts. Well, as it turns out, John was taught that behavior because his teacher taught him that John would go up to touch his teacher, and his teacher would say, "John, you have to ask a woman before you touch her." John would ask her, she would say no, end of story. Problem with that scenario is that asking to touch a woman is the last step in about a 487-step chain. Like, it's not, "Hi, my name is John, can I touch your breast?" There's a whole bunch of stuff in between, but we often think that, no, this is the rule is you don't touch your teacher. Like, you don't even get to ask to touch your teacher. Like, no matter how accommodating you think you want to be, this is one area where I have to go by what society says. Because if I don't, it's the individual who's going to suffer and not me. Consider using multiple instructional mediums. We almost never use the stuff that you can buy for sexuality, but we use other sort of things. Incorporate the social dimension of sexuality when and wherever appropriate, because all sexual behavior is social behavior. So 6 simple rules: simple, visual, individualized, repetitive, fun, and concrete. Now, this is why we make our own materials. These dolls, manufactured to teach sexuality education, and apparently that women give birth to gingerbread men. I think that's about it. They're very expensive, but completely useless for what we're trying to do. I'm sure they have uses somewhere else, but we can actually make our own materials. There are plenty of resources that we can pull from, so please don't just think that this is all you have. Social competence. 2 important skills we often ignore, punish, or extinguish. One is a functional no. Teach your students that no means no means no. We often teach kids that no is something that gets run over by adults. So, John, do you want to do math now? No? Well, too bad, it's math time. No is an incredibly important advocacy skill when they grow up. And situational noncompliance. One of the challenges we face working with kids who have more classic autism, what would be level 2 or 3 autism under DSM-5, is that they've been taught to become amazingly compliant. And a central safety skill is to be non-compliant. So we need to refocus some of our work on that.
So just a couple of strategies for professionals from me, your friendly neighborhood Auntie. Realize that dating is not just one skill, but multiple series of skill sets. If you're working with someone on the spectrum, it's a very complex thing to try to teach. And make sure to address the issue of consent. We do not discuss consent, I think, nearly enough among people with disabilities. We think that it's too abstract of a concept, but there are ways that it can be explained, ways to break it down, I think, and it's so crucially important, especially giving consent, not just receiving, but also giving, and create boundaries. Peter and I have both mentioned how we've seen, a female aide will be holding down a 15-year-old boy, and it's like, well, he's getting off on that, right? You can't do that, and so you have to start with these boundaries not when they're 15, because it's too late by then, but even when they're 5, because otherwise those boundaries will not be able to be applied to the real world. So it has to start from early on. Also, teach things at an age and developmental appropriate level. You don't have to, you have to meet somebody where they're at, basically. Where they may be chronologically, may not be where they are maturity-wise and what they're interested in. So look at where the person is and what they're interested in and teach from there. And there's lots of different ways to open a dialogue. It doesn't just have to be a huge discussion. It can just be talking about a movie. Hey, did you see that movie with whoever, and they were kissing? What did you think of that? That's the small little thing that can open a very big discussion. And it sounds so basic, but just acknowledge the sexual needs and desires of individuals on the spectrum. A lot of people just still don't do that, are not willing or able to do that, and that is so crucially important for anything else that follows, for all of this to follow. For parents, be a safe space for your child. So what that means is even if they're not ready to talk about sex or sexuality, if they know that you're there and that you will be open to answering their questions, getting past what I call the blushing cheek phase, so you're not embarrassed and therefore passing on ideas about shame to them, then they'll feel comfortable talking to you when and if they're ready. And the same thing here about discussing issues at an age and maturity appropriate level. You don't have to break out all the charts and diagrams and things like that. You can start with very small things. And then finally, please absolutely talk about abuse. And the reason is?
Although we don't have great data, sexual abuse is underreported among typical individuals, and it's even more underreported among individuals with the autism spectrum. Why? Because they're often not very good at self-reporting. Two, there may be confusion about whether or not this is abuse or not abuse. We teach kids to accept physical touch from another person and then don't discriminate who can touch you and who can't touch you. But there is a much higher rate of sexual victimization and abuse among people with autism spectrum disorders than there is among typical kids. And this is an area where, as a behavior analyst, we can have great impact, but all of us can have a big impact if we just teach some of the basic skills early on. So target discrimination between who can and who cannot touch the individual and where in his or her body. This includes hugs, kisses, tickle. Amy said, if he's 7 and a big reinforcer for him is tickles and kisses, that's not something I'm really going to encourage. And if it is something that is essential, then we're going to discriminate. This one person can do it, and that's all. Like I said before, target independent toileting, showering, menstrual care and dressing, closing and locking bathroom doors, independent public restroom use, functional noncompliance via the word no. And we're doing some work now on looking at the recall of temporally distant events. So what happened when, so that we can actually get kids to hopefully report if something does happen.
Yeah, so as we said, sexual abuse, it occurs at higher rates among autistic people, and it's reported much less frequently. A lot of times people on the spectrum are not believed when they report abuse, if they report it. A lot of times we also don't teach people on the spectrum what sexual abuse is. What does it look like? What do you do if it happens? Who do you tell? There's a double stigma involved, but with being autistic and then also being a victim of abuse, feeling ashamed. It becomes that much harder to discuss it and to feel like you can talk about it. And then Finally, we rely much too much on the concept of stranger danger. More often than not, somebody on the spectrum is likely to be abused by someone they know, someone who has access, be it a teacher, be it someone who sees them every day. So, we focus so much on strangers and we forget about the people who have the most access and by whom autistic people are most likely to be abused.
Some resources, if you are interested, Teaching Children with Down Syndrome About Their Bodies, Boundaries, and Sexuality by Terry Cohen. I'm not quite sure how to say her name. You can read it, and I don't want to mangle it. But this is, I think, probably the best book out there that gives instructional guidance when working with individuals who also have an intellectual disability. Now, because it's targeted to individuals who have more of a Down syndrome presentation, you have to sort of extrapolate into some of the social learning criteria when you're working with people with A.S.C.O.T. It's available on Amazon. It's really inexpensive, and all of these I get no kickback from. This is all just socially helpful for you. On the side, these are kind of like mini graphic novels that things Tom likes is about male masturbation, things Ellie likes is about female masturbation, about public restroom use. They're graphic, they're cute graphic, but they're still graphic, also relatively cheap and available on Amazon, like everything is. Probably the most comprehensive sexuality curriculum available today is the Our Whole Lives curriculum, which was put out by the Unitarian Universalist Church. I think there's 7 volumes, going from preschool up until older adulthood. It is, I will tell you, very wordy, but it does cover everything. It covers every aspect of sexuality, relationships, social competence, abuse, neglect, gender differences, gender identity. It really is very comprehensive. It's somewhat difficult to translate for use with our students, but if you need a good resource, this is it. And because it's 7 volumes, each volume is relatively inexpensive. I do recommend, particularly for parents or professionals, if you're interested in this, buy the 3 volumes, like one that is your son or daughter's or your student's age, and then the 2, one before and one after. So you sort of bookend them so you know what everything is supposed to do. The best journal, if not one of the few journals out there on the topic of sexuality and disability, is oddly enough called Sexuality and Disability, so you can check that out. The most accessible guide to just sexuality in general, human sexuality, is something called The Guide to Getting It On. Not the most professional title. You might not want to have it on your shelf at school, but it's 900-something pages written for a mass audience. This is the 9th edition. I think there's a 10th edition, or it's the 8th edition. Now there's a 10th edition. That's a little more graphic, so I kind of stick with this one. But if you have questions just about sexuality in general, it's an excellent resource. Autism Spectrum Disorder, Sexuality and the Law, very helpful overview. Isabelle Hinault out of Montreal, Canada, one of the field's experts on the topic. For people who are more verbal, more able, more cognitively able individuals, Asperger's syndrome and sexuality is an excellent resource. Girl Sex 101 is something that I've recently added to my library because, quite honestly, I know male sex 101. I don't know female sex 101, and I wanted to just become more knowledgeable of things that I may be missing. And one of the things that I've realized now is that we very, very rarely teach young women on the autism spectrum how to have a gynecological exam. And what often happens is very similar to what happens when boys or girls go to their dentist, is they end up being restrained to have this. And I think a gynecological exam right away is a potentially traumatic experience. And to restrain somebody during it is not what we would want to do. So we're looking at what do we need to do to prepare individuals for this.
So this is my contact information if you'd like to get in touch with me. This is the great way to do it. My email is the best way to reach me. And also this, I think, will be available when this is archived, so you can get a hold of this then. And we thank you so much for your attention today, and we're so glad you joined us. And now we'll open it up to questions.
Since we went through 70 slides in 55 minutes.
All right, awesome job, you two. I want to thank Dr. Gerhardt and Ms. Gravino, and that concludes the presentation portion. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to begin the Q&A session as they mentioned. Now, before we get started with that, I just want to draw your attention over to the downloads panel, the control panel. Remember that certificate of attendance there. You want to make sure you get that. And now we're going to begin the questions that were submitted during the presentation. And as a reminder, you can still submit those as well. So we're going to go ahead, I'll get started. And our first question is, and then whichever one of you two want to go ahead and take that, I'll let you do it. So the first question is, when would you recommend having discussions, say about pornography or masturbation with this population?
Well, I will tell you that the typical answer when you talk about with typical kids, it's usually when they first show interest, but honestly, that's too late. You need to be proactive about this. When it comes to masturbation, typical kids touch themselves an awful lot. When you hit puberty, there's a thing called reflex erections that often get pathologized in A.S.C. and they just happen. They're not sexual. It's just the body checking out the equipment because we notice that they have an erection, so they would think they're sexually aroused. You don't have to talk about masturbation, but you can talk about privacy. You can talk about what you do in your bedroom versus what you do in the living room. You can set up that sort of discrimination very early on. Pornography, like the challenge with pornography, and I think it's a problem beyond the autism community, is that it presents a wholly unrealistic version of human sexuality. And if someone on the spectrum tends to be a concrete learner, and we've also done a lot with video modeling with that, like that becomes their go-to guide. And actually there's research that typical kids starting in middle school are using pornography as an instructional guide. That's a problem. The impact may be greater within the autism community, but I think a challenge across, particularly since they have no competing information because we're not doing sex ed. So looking early on is always better. There's also something called Rule 34, which is if it exists as internet porn. So if you think, well, my son is into Thomas the Tank, he's not going to, there's Thomas the Tank porn, there's Spider-Man porn, there's Barney porn, there's porn about everything. So just be aware, like check their web browsers, check smart kids get past these nanny things. And so don't just count on that, but you got to be as early into this as possible. So that's the best advice I can give. Do you agree?
Absolutely, I agree. Sooner the better. And trust us about the Rule 34 thing. Don't Google it for the love of God. But it's absolutely true. As I said, I wasn't watching porn, but I was reading porn at 14, and it distorts the reality. I know I heard a story once. It was a young man he was on the spectrum. He finally had a girlfriend, and she, went to take her top off, and, his knowledge base came from pornography. And when she took her top off, he said, "Oh, I thought they'd be bigger." And of course that devastated her beyond words. And so, but that was where his knowledge base was from. And so pornography does not reflect real sexuality and real sex. And it's important to inform people of that right away.
All right, awesome. So we have another question. This is a long one, so let's see if we can do this. It says, we work for a private STEM-focused university, and we have seen increased accusations of stalking and sexual harassment under Title IX. Some of this stems from our male students with A.S.D, missing body language, nonverbal related disinterest, and their actions are either inappropriate or simply misunderstood. So is there any training available for intellectually gifted college students with A.S.D as it relates to relationships and boundaries? If not, what should be included in such a training?
I don't know.
This is, I think, a very significant challenge right now, particularly in the college level, because the behavior pattern of people on the spectrum has always sort of been there, but it was sort of brushed off as like inappropriate or geeky or just weird. Now it's stalking. Now it's a sexual offense. particularly with the Me Too movement, which is a very appropriate thing. It's a very good thing. But I think people are so much more sensitized to it that it's very easy for this behavior to be seen as threatening. The best resource that I go back to Our Whole Lives. I look at some of the older material there. Trying to think what else is available. We, even Hollywood movies, like an example I usually give is if like Say Anything, the John Cusack movie at the end where he's holding up the boombox and it's playing Peter Gabriel, like that's stalking. That's not love. That's just stalking me. So there's this presentation of, male persistence that is not necessarily appropriate in the vast majority of cases. So we would look at sort of this discrimination skills. Part of the challenge with stalking is that it gets intimately reinforced from a behavioral point of view. Even if the target yells at the person, that's attention. So it becomes sort of difficult to convince somebody not to do it, but it is going to land the person in jail. We've done stuff where we have taken individuals to local prisons so they get a sense of what it means even. I don't know how effective it is. We have no data on any of that, but my best resource would be looking at some of the stuff that's in Our Whole Lives. And if there's a Unitarian Universal Church by you, they usually have somebody who is trained in how to teach this stuff. So it's a potentially decent resource for you.
Yes, no, I would agree. I think it's become a larger issue. As I said, I went through my own experience with stalking, not even knowing it was stalking. We hear stories about there was I read it in the news, a young man on the spectrum who was he kicked out of the school, I think, because he was accused of stalking, and he just simply asked for a handshake, or it was completely blown out of proportion, whatever it was. So yeah, there needs to be more education on both sides, I think.
But I think it's very easy to, like, if I'm on the spectrum and I'm attracted to this female student in college, and so I sit next to her in class, and so the next class, she feels uncomfortable, so she moves where she sits, and then I go and sit next to her again. Now, in my vision, that may be very appropriate, that I'm just trying to get to know her, that I'm not touching her, but it's still harassment. Mm-hmm. And so we have to be sort of very clear about what is and what isn't, and what constitutes problematic behavior and what doesn't. Like, unfortunately, in an area that contains a lot of gray, we have to be very black and white.
Okay, so our next question, how do you educate a child or a family about sexual abuse?
Well, as I mentioned, again, steering away from the whole stranger danger thing. I think talking about someone who has more access being a more likely predator than a stranger, and explaining that abuse comes in different forms. It isn't just, sexual always. There's physical. You can start with emotional abuse, financial. It could show up in many different ways, and then can progress to that. And just talking about why it is that someone may not report it or may not understand what it is, how manipulative abusers are to victims, especially victims on the spectrum.
Yeah, and I think one of the mistakes that is often made is that we don't talk about it with parents till later. I think it's a difficult topic, but we have to talk about it, earlier on, but from a very preventative, positive, like this is what we need to do. Yeah. Whether it's dressing independently and that's why. It's not just a life skill. It's these things. Then there's some research on what may be signs that someone is a victim that we can educate some families in. We are all mandated reporters, so we all have to, well, in New Jersey, I don't know, different states. So if we do think, then we have to report it. But I also think it's important to sit down and talk about the broad definition of sexual abuse. For example, like we often talk about, like I said, I work with individuals with some pretty significant challenges, but I really don't want to have to monitor them in the bathroom. I think that's intrusive. I think that is a potential for a potentially abusive situation. So how do we get them to the point where they don't need me there? That's a big thing. And then the last point I want to make, and I have no research on this, and I'm not sure, but I do believe that the more people in your community who know your son or daughter, who know your students, the safer they are. I mean, there is safety in numbers, and if everybody knows this person, and God forbid you're at the Starbucks and somebody tries to take somebody out of Starbucks, that should, like, somebody else at Starbucks is going to say, wait a minute, like, where are you going with John? Because they know him. We have a tendency to sort of think isolation is protection, and it's not.
No.
That's the greatest risk, is when we isolate. So the more people who know the individual, the safer they're going to be. I know that was a really shitty answer, but there isn't a clear answer. So that's the best I can do.
Thank you for answering that. So now our next question. Do you recommend introducing sexuality lessons or say skills even when an adolescent or adult is not presenting any signs of sexual interest that we're aware of? Now, should we as educators assume that all clients need to address this area and that they may not be sharing their interests with family or even a therapist?
I would say so, certainly. I mean, again, as I had said, you want to meet somebody where they are developmentally, and they may not be sharing what they're interested in, but it doesn't mean, you know, when I was that younger age, I was very shy. I was not expressing things out loud, but in here it was like a rock concert. It was so loud, and there was so much going on. So you never know what is going on in someone's mind, what they're thinking about, what they're processing. And especially a lot of folks on the spectrum tend to come across as shy or as more introverted, but there's so much more that you don't know about, that you don't know what's happening with somebody. And so, and certainly there may be some people who are genuinely not interested. There are certainly people who are asexual. It's become a stereotype of people on the spectrum, but there are people who genuinely identify that way. But for the rest, it's never just assume that there's a lack of interest just because it's not being expressed.
And also, I think we still want to look at safety skills. We still want to look at understanding your changing body. We still want to look at, that you know the names of your body parts. We still want to look at all of those things, although we may not get into sort of a real complex instructional sequence about intimacy. But I think there's so much to sexuality before you get to that we can still attend to a whole lot of aspects like in that area. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. There's so many other things. Because sexuality isn't just sex. People make that mistake. They think sexuality, we said this, that it means sex, but it's about so many more things than that. It's about self-care, hygiene, puberty, hormone. Like, there's so many other things that encompass that. So.
All right. So now, how do you present this information, say, in a fun way? So they said, I'm working with the male on the spectrum, and he always states that my activities are boring. Any idea of how to make the information interesting?
There you go, Amy.
Yeah, hire me and have me come talk to him. I can make it pretty interesting. I don't. I mean, obviously, there's some of the things that Peter showed you today. Those are pretty fun. I think pretty animated things, and I don't it's a fine line because obviously you want it to be informational, but you don't want it to be like cartoonish or too over the top, and you want it to be age appropriate above all. Like you don't want to be using cutesy little dolls for somebody who's 17 years old, for example. But I mean, to me, sex is inherently fun. I don't know if it's not fun, you're doing something wrong. But what do you think?
Well, no, I think there's also you have to be, if you're teaching it, you have to be very serious. You have to be very
exactly.
And I really do understand the question. Like I said, some of the things that we've tried to do in the past, and sometimes they've been successful, sometimes they haven't, with more verbal, more cognitively able individuals. We would do a lot using like Hollywood movies. So we would like pull from it like videos and to give demonstrations of stuff. For example, my favorite movie to use in those situations was the Jack Nicholson Helen Hunt movie, As Good as It Gets, because it has two people who have really screwed up social skills and behavior issues trying to establish a relationship and make this. And so we could watch like a couple minutes and then stop it and say, now tell me what you think they should do. Let's guess. What do you think is the next step here? What should they do? And then we can play it and we can make it sort of a game. There's also, it would require an awful lot of time, but you can if you've never seen Degrassi Junior High,
Oh God.
the first series or the next gen, it is probably, it's a Canadian sort of kids soap opera kind of thing, but they deal with real issues of sexuality, and a couple of those episodes, there's a 4 or 5 episode arc of where a teacher is actually providing too much attention to a female student, and her friends are telling her no, and she's thinking that she's a special student and all this sort of. So the production values are good. The story appears on it. Those sort of things we try and pull in. I just think the things that are out there that are manufactured for this are so stiff and somewhat fake that it's hard to. I just don't use them. Other people may. I'm not knocking. If anybody out there's done them, good for you. But it's just not what I use. So.
There is, I don't know how appropriate this may be, depends on the age of your learner, but there is from the comedy group Monty Python, there's the penis song and the vagina song, which, as we talked about all the different euphemisms for these body parts, the song literally lists them all. I mean, it's very, very funny, but it's on YouTube. You can simply search Monty Python, penis song, and it comes right up, and so that might make it a little more fun.
Yeah, I would say also, this is also an area where you got to work with parents, and you got to get consent, and you got to be very clear about what you're doing, and but it's difficult because you want to be informal, you want to be relaxed, but at the same time you're an authority figure, so you have to be very. So it's another line that we walk trying to do this stuff.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So this one is addressed to Amy, and it says, Amy, what would have been a helpful response from a professional if he or she was aware of your experience with the violation of your privacy online with sex feedback form?
I couldn't hear the last part. What was the?
So it's here. I'll do it again. So it says, what would have been a helpful response from a professional if he or she was aware of your experience with the violation of your privacy online with sex feedback form?
When your ex posted that stuff online.
Well, he didn't post the form. It was an email that was sent to me. So that they're two separate. That's why I got confused. I was in therapy at the time, I think, but my psychologist who had diagnosed me was across the country, so I didn't really have anybody to talk to. I think, I don't know that I would have necessarily listened to what a professional might have said, because when you are going through something like that, something that is so painful, it's very hard to have any kind of rational thought process. I think at least if the person told me, this isn't your fault, you didn't do anything wrong, that would have been a good thing to hear, because I did kind of blame myself to an extent. I did feel like I was so stupid, and how could I fall for someone who I thought cared about me the same way, but obviously didn't. It was one of those, I called it trial by fire, because I had to learn, the hard way, unfortunately. It's not something that I think someone could have prevented from happening. So, it's really hard to say what a professional could have said, because again, in that moment when I'm having that emotional response, there's nothing I want to hear except him calling me saying, I actually want to be with you, not her. That was all I wanted to hear at that point. So that's my honest answer.
Okay. So now, next question. So at a conference, the presenter said that there are more individuals with A.S.C. that identify as gay. Are you familiar with any studies to support this?
Actually, there's 2 or 3 studies that actually indicate that it's with very high verbal, very cognitively able individuals, that they report slightly higher rates of being gay, bisexual, lesbian, but the studies look at females. I'm not aware of a study with males where there's that difference. So it may be out there. I just haven't seen it. So it does appear that is true. I think an interesting question, and Amy, I don't know if you think this is an issue. I would be interested to see to what extent women on the spectrum are just giving very honest answers, and women not on the spectrum, there's a percentage that sort of lies. Just because it's I don't think a researcher needs to know this about me. Why should I tell that person that? Where, and because the difference isn't large. It may be statistically significant, but it's not a large difference. So we don't know, but it is accurate. It is a finding right now that's been repeated at least twice. So at least with women. I'm like I said, I don't know if there's data on males, but at least with females.
And in addition to gay, there's also a higher number of people on the spectrum who identify as transgender a lot of times than the neurotypical population. We've seen that too.
Right.
Okay. So now, how do you handle parent involvement when teaching adults about sexuality? So parents are sometimes reluctant about teaching certain parts of sexuality, like sexual or gender identity, due to religious or cultural views.
I honestly, if it's a strong religious or a strong cultural issue, there's not a whole hell of a lot I can do. I mean, I have to work within the context of the family. If the individual is their own guardian, then I have a different avenue because they can then give consent for treatment. If they can't give consent for treatment or related intervention, then I have to go with what the family says. But I do emphasize that sexual education is not about teaching people how to have sex. It's how to be safe. That is hard. All I want to do is teach people how to be safe and not to be victims. And the information that I would share with them is no different than the information that the parents have, and they have the same cultural values. They have those cultural values. So I would just provide that information, and I would work with the family in that context. But it becomes difficult when there are those boundaries, and I have to, unfortunately or fortunately, it's my obligation to respect those boundaries. I can't go around them. I can't. So sometimes it becomes a stalemate about what I can and cannot do.
I mean, I don't work with minors. You know, my work has usually been with people over the age of 18. So to me, you're free from your parents, and I have a very strong sense of what I believe is right, and I can't, you know, not give information that I feel is the person. If someone's asking me this and they're saying, oh, you know, like I'm afraid, you know, my parents would be upset if they knew. I was like, well, I'm going to give you an honest answer. Like I find that I can't, you know, circumvent my sense of belief. I'm in a different position than Peter. I'm not, you know, working with clients the way that he is. But I you know, I really feel like this information is too vital and too crucial to not be honest and straightforward. It's people's lives we're talking about ultimately. And the cost is too high to not be giving this information.
Okay, great answer. So that does look like that was the last of the questions that we have that we can do today. So I want to thank both of you. You did an awesome, amazing job. So now that is all that we have time for today. And I want to thank you, Peter and Amy, and thank you to everyone who joined us in today's webinar. Now remember, once you close out of the event, you're going to receive an exit survey. And we would appreciate if you would go ahead and complete that and provide your feedback. Then also everyone is going to receive a follow-up email with the link to today's recording. I know some of you asked that. And also some materials in a couple of weeks. Now, on behalf of the Organization for Autism Research, Dr. Gerhardt and Ms. Gravino, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and all of you have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.